Dr. Davis, how do you describe what your job is right now?
I think I've morphed myself into a science communicator.
Okay. You morphed yourself into it. Like
Yes.
you didn't go to school to become a science
No.
communicator. So what does a science communicator do then?
I give people the information and tools they need to make informed choices that honor their own priorities.
So why did you create this position for yourself? Because clearly it wasn't a job that you went and got at some institution.
Well, I created it because I felt a need personally to actually use science to answer some questions in my own life, particularly around my children and their eating. I wanted to make sure I was doing the right thing. So I answered these questions for myself, and then I sort of became an expert amongst my peers and started to realize that a lot of my peer group are struggling with knowing, what to buy, what to believe in the news, and I just saw a need.
So I introduced you as Dr. Davis. Let's talk about what your doctorate is, because you're not an MD.
Correct.
Yeah. So what is your doctorate in?
I did my PhD in human genetics.
In human genetics. So you understand about the interplay between environmental influences and the genome.
Definitely.
Let's go all the way back to when
And
you
I
were...
should say, I have twins as well, so I have a lovely live-in experience in nature versus nurture. So
Right, because you get to see it play out
you get to see it
individually
play out. It's a lot of fun.
with almost an exact copy of...
They're not identical.
Oh, they're
but
not identical?
Not identical.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Huh, isn't that interesting? Well, let's go back to the beginning of your career. When you're exiting high school, what did you say? This is what I want to be, because it wasn't a health communicator.
Yeah. Well, I always loved genetics. Again, that nature and nurture question, as a child, you're asking, why am I this way? Why do I like this and my brother doesn't? And, why are we different? And why, I was always interested, why am I similar? I look a lot like my parents, how is it that I look like you and not like you, and all these things. So I was always interested in genetics. I did my bachelor's in genetics at University of British Columbia. So again, just following my natural curiosity, it seemed that just one of the most fundamental questions out there is, why are we the way we are? How much control do we have over the way we are? How much of it's written into our DNA versus just other factors.
Did you find those answers, or are you still seeking them out?
I believe, of course it depends on the trait that we're talking about, but especially after having my twins, I believe that there's a very strong role genetics plays, and not just in the way we look, but in our psychology.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I hear, it's genetics, and then I hear other people say, no, it's lifestyle, and other go, no, it's this combination. You're not doomed to the genetic blueprint that you've been given. What have you learned is the answer there?
One of the phrases I like is that genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger.
Oh, that's good.
So genetics is all about predispositions.
Yes.
So, but then whether or not that predisposition plays out, you have a lot of control.
So
I certainly, I don't throw up my hands and say my fate is sealed by any stretch of the imagination.
No,
but I think that we have tendencies that our genetics gives us.
Yeah. Okay. So you complete your studies at UBC. Where'd you go from there?
Stanford.
Stanford.
Yeah, they had a great program in genetics. I was interested in bioinformatics as well. Part of what drew me to Stanford.
Okay, explain what that is.
That is, using computers to sort of parse biological information. So that was in the year I started graduate school in the year 2000. So human genome data was coming out. We were starting to have volumes of information that we wanted people to be able to interpret that. And so I thought that I liked computer programming and I liked math, and it would be a nice way to marry the biological questions with some of that kind of technical work.
So you go to Stanford and you complete your PhD there. What was your thesis?
Well, my thesis had a couple parts to it. My first project was around normal variation in gene expression in blood cells. So looking at, I think this is one of the themes of the work that I did was understanding normal variation as a foundation for that we need before we can understand disease. So whether it's the human microbiome or whether it's, what does a normal amount of blood cells, white blood cells look like? As we develop higher resolution tools in the lab, we can't use those tools on disease until we know what normal looks like. So I was looking at normal blood cells in healthy people and what are, different levels of different subpopulations, for example, and the genes that they're expressing at a given state and time. So that was project 1, was gene expression in normal blood cells. Project 2 was all around understanding the human microbiome. And so step 1 of that was building a DNA-based tool for studying microbial populations, essentially to do a census of what's in this complex sample using this DNA-based tool. Prior to that, microbial studies had really been hampered by the fact that you had to grow microbes in order to actually sort of count them. So if you had, for example, a stool sample, one of the most interesting samples out there, it used to be that you would have to grow those cells up in the lab and sort of try and culture them in different plates and then count them. But with DNA, it's what they call a culture-independent method. So you just break the cells apart, use their DNA as a fingerprint because different species have different sequences, and you can sort of let that DNA stick to a microscope chip, and then you can fluorescently label it, and you can see which microbes are there. So I developed a tool to look at microbial samples and complex human samples and see which bacterial species are there. And then
you developed
that tool. Well, the technology exists. So my work was on the bioinformatics side, was building. The tool is called a microarray, and or a DNA chip, and on that chip would be specific sequences. So I was the one that built the database and designed the sequences. Which sequences are going to be the tags that we can then use to figure out which bacteria are present. So I developed sort of the barcodes that were used on the chip. So that was a lot of technology validation work, and then I used that technology to study newborn babies from the day they were born for up to a year. How did their gut microbiome populations evolve?
What did you do with that tool? Was it commercialized?
No, there was some interest. I did this in collaboration with Agilent, and they, I don't know, they carried that product forward, but I think more in research use than a commercialized product.
Huh.
But yeah, but the thing is, after technology evolved so quickly that the DNA chips quickly got replaced now by just DNA sequencing, which is more indirect. So we're using the DNA chip as a sort of indirect way to figure out which sequences were there. But now it's so cheap that you can just sequence the DNA directly. So people don't use the DNA chips as much.
So as you're explaining your educational path, can you sort of cast your mind back to when you were a student in high school thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to get a PhD? It's not that easy. It can look like it's a very daunting task. What gave you the inner confidence to know that you could complete this?
I think mentorship played a big role. So I had a very close family friend whose mother had a PhD in genetics. And so, we met, my friend and I, we joke we met in the sandbox. We literally did meet in the sandbox. So this woman was a part of my life since I was 2 years old and was a strong mentor. My mom was pursuing her PhD when I was in high school. She has a PhD in education. So I think just having people around you normalizes it and makes it seem achievable.
Right, because to somebody who's outside of that process, they think, oh my gosh, how do you do that? And so I think you're absolutely right. Mentorship plays a big role.
Yeah.
What about just your own level of curiosity? I mean, you talked about, well, how come this, how come that? How much of a driver was that in your pursuit of building your career?
Well, that was a big driver. I mean, I think the thing about science is so often the more you learn, the more you realize that you've just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
And so pursuing a bachelor's in science, with an emphasis on genetics, I came away feeling like, I couldn't do anything. I felt like I had just scratched the surface, and if I wanted to actually contribute, there was no option for me but to do that.
So you forged on.
Yeah.
And so you graduate from Stanford. You've got your PhD. Where'd you go work?
My first job was at a nonprofit that worked in cancer research. So it was technically a sort of program director / scientific program manager position, where I was the only staff scientist at the nonprofit. So the nonprofit was a research funder, essentially, and they funded academics to do research related to early detection, with an emphasis on ovarian cancer initially. So I was sort of the interface in many ways between the nonprofit and the scientists. I also helped interface between the nonprofit and some of their donors to be a bit of a science translator. I suppose I've always had an affinity towards teaching, and that's a bit of my career story comes from
where you are now.
Yeah, my parents are both in education, and that just came naturally to me, and I enjoyed it. And when I was in graduate school, I volunteered at the San Jose Tech Museum. They had an Ask a Geneticist program. We helped kids extract DNA from strawberries. So I always enjoyed that outreach component.
Where'd you go from this not-for-profit?
Yeah, so that was called the Canary Foundation, and
That was in the Bay Area.
That was in the Bay Area.
Okay.
Although they actually did fund some research up in Vancouver, which I liked because I got to visit my family up here.
Yeah.
So after Canary Foundation, we went overseas briefly, and I took a mini hiatus. And then when I came back to the Bay Area, I worked at Genentech again. In cancer specifically. So I was in a group that was sort of the personalized medicine cancer diagnostics group. And I think it's a fascinating field because personalized medicine has sort of become a theme of my work, in that we're getting more and more to a point where we can tailor medicines to those most likely to respond. And so it was the group within the organization that was focused on the diagnostic side. So if you've heard the term companion diagnostics.
No, I have not.
So these are particularly important in something like cancer, where drugs have very serious downsides. So you don't want to give them to people who are not going to respond to the drug.
No.
And so it's worth investing money. So the Genentech then became acquired by Roche. For some products, they have a diagnostic test that is paired with the drug, and that you're not supposed to take the drug unless you are, you take the diagnostic test and your tumor is found to be of this specific type.
So is that pharmacogenomics then? Or a variation on that?
Yeah, so pharmacogenomics, yeah, I would say it is. Some people categories, different people have different definitions for pharmacogenomics, but many people do include, I think, the most common use of pharmacogenetics that's most visible is sort of safety and adverse reactions.
Right.
But this is more about who's actually going to respond to the drug. So many
Right.
people will consider that pharmacogenomics, but other people like to own that and call that its own thing, a personalized medicine. And
well, you see, I thought that it was about, well, this is a known drug reaction if you have this SIP and these environmental factors or whatnot.
So the more poster child pharmacogenomics is more about predicting adverse reactions.
Yeah.
Whereas the group that I was in, it was more, for example, like Genentech was a leader in developing these antibody therapies where the Herceptin is a poster child with only if your breast cancer tumor is a HER2 positive tumor, does this drug make any sense?
Right.
So you have to have a diagnostic test because, again, cancer is such a heterogeneous disease that you can't just say breast cancer is one disease. You want to know which type you have at a molecular level before you prescribe a drug.
Isn't it fascinating, the work that you're in, and how this now informs you with the work that you are doing now as a communicator, a health communicator? What does a day look like for you now as you help other people try and make sense of all of this so that they can make informed decisions?
I'm still, because my background, my formal training is in genetics, I spend a lot of my time, I've been basically trying to teach myself the whole world of nutrition just through scientific studies and looking at expert organizations and real scientific data. So I've been doing a lot of self-education and basically sharing with people the things that I'm learning on my own journey to live my healthiest life and to feed my children well. So I do, a good chunk of my time, I just work for myself remotely. A good chunk of my days is spent researching, just in the weeds of the scientific papers, trying to understand them. And then the other time is trying to sort of digest that information for others. And I'm still playing with different platforms. So I'm learning social media, how do I put this on Instagram? How do I put this on Facebook in a way? How do I reach the most people? Is it Instagram? Is it Facebook? Is it videos? So I'm experimenting with different platforms. I gave a seminar at my son's elementary school. So I'm doing a whole variety of different, I love it. I love reaching people and being able to have those conversations to help clarify what's so confusing for people.
Well, the development of this program that we're working on with you, I think, hopefully will give you a platform to invite some other people who have particular insights to come in and share those directly with you, enhancing your knowledge base, but also sharing it with a growing audience.
Definitely. I think it's a perfect fit.
Well, I agree, because nutrition is so fundamentally important if we want to have a good life. I keep thinking about, poor Steve Jobs, who there he was near the end of his life saying, well, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And here's a guy who radically changed the way we live. And he is saying, well, without health,
Yeah.
You know, and so
And of all the choices we make every day, diet is one of the most profound. I would say we don't emphasize sleep enough, so that's something I've done research on. We don't emphasize stress enough, but diet is one where we have so much room for improvement on our standard diet. It doesn't take much to make a big difference.
oh, you talk about sleep. You know, I'm a lifelong tennis fan, and Roger Federer, who's 38 years of age and still at the top of the game, you know, he's basically asked, well, you know, what's your secret weapon? He says, I sleep a lot, and he apparently sleeps like a lot. And he says that is the magic.
Yeah.
It gives his body the opportunity to heal.
I'm not surprised at all. It's something that we've, you know, it bothers me a lot when it's sort of a badge of pride to sleep less. I think we've got to get away from that.
Sleep more.
Embrace sleep.
I will try to do so. Thank you very much.